Hi there! In this video we're going to be routing for a dual or double action truss rod. So this style of truss rod has an advantage in that it's much easier to install than a single action truss rod. So with a traditional single action truss rod you need a curved channel, so you've got a different depth as you go along. Whereas with a dual action truss rod, like in this video, it's the same depth all the way along, so it's much more simple. The other obvious advantage is with a dual action truss rod you can adjust it both ways, so you can increase forward bow and back bow on the finished neck. So this will be a good video if you've not got much woodworking experience and if you've never built a guitar neck before. This will be the exact same process whether you're working on a guitar neck or a bass neck, just obviously it'll be a longer channel for a bass neck. Before you start, you'll need to make sure your neck blank is already fully dimensioned, so it's at the correct thickness and you need a dead flat surface across the top. And then you'll also need a straight and square edge on the neck blank, because we're going to be using the router edge guide. If there's any kind of bumps in that edge, the router edge guide will follow that, and then you'll end up with a wonky truss rod slot. So with all that said, we're going to get started now. So here's the neck blank which we'll be working on today. This is some really nice ancient bog oak. So this dates from about 2500 BC. And it's actually the first bog oak neck I will have done. I've done plenty of bog oak fretboards before, but never a bog oak neck, so I'm excited to do this. And you can see I've already got in a central line drawn in, and an end point for the truss rod slot here rather, that's the end of the neck. And then at the other end I've got a stopping point there. And these two clamps are in position to stop the router going any further. So this is the type of truss rod we're going to be routing for today. And this is a standard dual action truss rod, and these require only a straight slot rather than a curved one like a single action rod does, and they're really nice and easy to install. We're going to talk through how to best to install this, as in the position in the neck, and also we're going to go into filler strips as well. So this is obviously on its side now, it's going to go this way up, and this type of rod will require a 6mm slot for all this bit. And then you can see the head, or the adjuster here, is a bit bigger. So the actual size you use for that is really up to you, as long as it's big enough to allow it in. I think the minimum on this one would be an 8mm, but then it's going to be a little tight. So I actually like to go up to a 12mm for this, just to give you plenty of room with the truss rod key. So that's basically what we're going to be doing, just cutting this slot down the middle of the neck. And as far as position goes, I like it the rod to be as long as possible, really. So you've only got this tiny section which isn't supported by the truss rod. You can push that a bit more. If this rod was a bit shorter, it wouldn't really matter, because this area is supported in the body. This is a bolt-on neck, so all that area is held rigid in the body anyway. But you can't go wrong from having it as long as possible, really. And then at this end, I like to have the end of the rod here go about 4mm past the nut. So this line here is my nut, and I've got 4mm past. The fretboard will be somewhere about here, and this is the end of where I'm going to stop routing. But this is where I'm going to stop routing with the 6mm bit. So if I keep everything as it is, as in with this stop here, and then I change the bit from a 6mm to a 12mm, it'll actually end there, which is exactly where I want it to end. So that's how we control the two end stops. We have those clamps in place here. You can see the neck blank's just long enough for me to get this one on here. And then for the to allow access of the edge guide, which we're using on the router over there, you can see I've got a piece of wood underneath here to raise the whole thing up, so I'm not dragging it across the workbench. And then we're going to be cutting it with the edge guide on the router here, and we're going to use this on this side. And when you're routing, you should have the direction of the cut going that way or into the fence, and that pulls it into it and keeps everything central. If you go the other way, it'll actually try to pull away from you, and then you won't have a straight slot. So we're using a 6mm bit, ordinary straight bit, and then we're going to use a 12mm bit up here. I've got the router set to do a very shallow cut first. The bit's basically just touching the surface, and that's just to test that everything's okay, and make sure the edge guide's set up correctly and these two stops are in the right place. Once that's been tested, I can then increase the depth, and I'll be cutting about 2 to 3mm with each pass. And then we're going to do the whole section with the 6mm bit, and then at the end we're going to do the bigger bit, the 12mm bit down here. I'm going to route to a total depth of about 10.5 to 11mm because I'm going to use a filler strip over the top of the wad. The actual wad is only about 9mm, but I'm going to allow an extra 1.5 millimeters to insert a filler strip on top. So you should be able to just make out there's a very fine line there, just feel it. And I've checked that that's in the dead center, and I've stopped where I want to on both ends. So now I'm going to increase the depth. We're about halfway there now, and I just thought I'd show a close-up of the edge guide itself, just in case you're not familiar with one of these. So this is the bit which runs up against the edge of the neck blank here, and this edge of the neck is obviously got to be dead straight and square. If you've got bumps in this, the edge guide will then follow that, and your slot will be all over the place. So that's first thing before you do anything, is make sure this is dead straight and square. We're nearly there now. To check the depth, I like to use the bottom part of the caliper here, the depth gauge. So you can see that bit comes out. So I'm going to put that on the neck like this, and then push down. And you can see we're at 10.2 at the moment. I want to go a little tiny bit more than that. Anywhere between sort of 10.7 and 11 is fine with me. So we're going to go that little bit deeper now. Very shallow pass. So we're now at our finished depth of 11 and 0.6 of a millimeter, which is basically nothing, so that's good. And it's a good idea to check that depth all the way up to make sure it's consistent. If it's not, it'll either be you're not clamping it properly. With the two clamps, you might be clamping a bow into it, or it could be that the neck itself is not flat, but you should have already planed this beforehand. You should always start with this completely dimensioned perfectly, otherwise you will get inconsistent results. So I've just laid the truss rod in the slot, and you can see it's obviously not going to go in because of this adjuster here on the end, the nut, which is slightly too wide. So we're going to route for this section now. You can see I've just drawn a little pencil line in there, and that's going to be where our wider section starts. So we're going to go from over here to down there for the wider section, and that's going to allow us room for the truss rod nut itself and also the Allen key to adjust it. I've now swapped over the bit in the router for this larger bit, which is actually 1/2 inch, so 12.7 millimeter. And I've also added this third clamp here to stop me going too far down the neck. So we're just going to wrap this last section there, and that'll be it mostly done. I should also mention I haven't adjusted the edge guide since routing for the rest of the channel, so this is going to be still in the exact same center where it should be. So now the nut sits nicely in its wider section here, and you can see it tapers in just where we wanted it to, and it stops at the other end just where we wanted to. This isn't actually pressed in yet. I don't want to put it in just yet because I like to do one last job, which is at the other end. You can see this little void there. I like to chisel out the corners of this round section to make it square so it sits perfectly along the back of the wad. It's not at all necessary, it's just something I like to do, just to make everything sit a bit snugger. So after about a minute with the chisel, you can see now it sits nice and flushly against the back of the rout. So we can now press this in, and then we can put our filler strip in. I've now pressed the truss rod into the slot. It's a really nice tight fit, and you can see we've got this little bit of extra depth which we planned for our filler strip. And so I've always used filler strips for the last, I don't know, 12, 13, 14 years, something like that. On my very early necks I didn't use them, and I would notice on certain notes there would be a little kind of lack of sustain, and sometimes even a little rattle. You'd hear an overtone on some notes coming through the neck because there's a little bit of movement between the fretboard and the truss rod. Because you can mount these truss rods just so this flat bit of the rod sits very flush with the top of the neck there. And that's why I did on my early necks. And then, like I said, I didn't have as good results. I've actually noticed a big improvement in the tone since I started using a filler strip and the sustain of the neck. So basically the idea is the filler strip pushes hard against the back of the neck like that, so there can be no movement at all. So that's what we're going to do now. We're going to prepare a filler strip and get it glued into the neck. So here's my filler strip material. This is oak in this case, but normally maple is the common choice, and that works great. Basically any hardwood will work. And this whole piece here has been planed down to 6mm, so I can just cut more off this when I need it, and you can see it's massively oversized. So I've just cut a piece from this, and the important thing is it's flat on the underside. Get this out. You can see it's a tight fit. So on this side here, which rests against the truss rod on here, that needs to be perfectly planed and not just a sawn surface. And then obviously you need a decent fit as well. Now you don't want to overdo it and make it too tight that you can't get it in there, but you don't want it loose either. So we're going to put some glue on this now and get it clamped in. So before we glue this, I'm just going to put a couple of pieces of masking tape down either side, just so we don't have to clean up too much glue afterwards. The actual amount of glue we use is very minimal, but it still saves it soaking into the wood, because obviously this surface needs to be kept nice and clean for the fretboard gluing later on. And if it's a pre-glued surface and it's got glue already stuck into it, the glue won't stick properly to that. Now we're just going to use a very small amount of tight bond glue on the two edges. We don't want to get too much glue on the actual underside of it, which makes contact with the truss rod. It's not going to really do too much harm, but there's just no point getting it on that surface because it won't stick to the metal. This is one of those times when wood glue is definitely better than epoxy, because if you're going to use epoxy for this, you'd have to be very careful you don't get the truss rod filler strip actually stuck to the truss rod. We don't want that to happen, we just want to stick it to the wood. And if we do get wood glue on the mating surface there, between the truss rod and the thing, it's not a big deal, because it will just come off when the truss rod's adjusted. So you'll actually hear like a creak or crack of that becoming unstuck when you would first adjust the truss rod. So as you can see, it's a nice tight fit, but we're still going to clamp it anyway just to make sure it's all the way to the bottom. So got it in at the bottom there now, so we'll clamp it from that way forward. So my clamps are just long enough to reach the truss rod, you can see. And we don't have to put too much force on this, it's just to make sure it's down at the bottom of as far as it can go. You see that go down hopefully then. Obviously the truss rod will go down, the filler strip will go down more in the middle than it will at the end, because there's more material at the two ends. There's the block on the end of the truss rod at both ends, so that bit's a bit taller, whereas in the middle there's less material there. There we go, all the clamps are now on, and we're going to give this neck overnight for the glue to dry. When the glue is dry, we can take off these clamps and we'll plane off the excess filler strip material you can see here. So there's about 3mm, something like that, which we'll plane off by hand. I've also taken off the masking tape, just because it's a bit easier to take off before it sets, kind of thing. The longer it stays on there, the harder it is to get off, especially if you get any glue on it as well. It can actually become quite stuck then. So I've taken that off as soon as we've finished spreading the glue about. So I'll see you tomorrow. Time for a beer. It's now the next day and the glue's all set. I'm going to use a block plane to shape this all down. I've got a bit extra on this end here, so I'm going to get that with a chisel first to make it a bit quicker. So I'm now going to do the rest with the plane. The filler strip is now all nice and flush. If you run your finger across it, you can't really feel any difference in it at all. And we've got a nice join all the way up, as you can tell. There's no gaps there or anything like that, which is great. If you didn't want to hand plane this flush like I just did, you could actually shove the whole neck through the thickness planer if it's a bolt-on neck like this with no angled headstock. Obviously if it's an angled headstock, don't do that. But if you don't want to use a hand plane, or you don't have one, you're not very good reusing one, you could do that. You just obviously have to be careful that you stop before you actually hit the main neck wood. So you have to be very careful that you don't reduce the whole thickness to any considerable amount anyway. Sometimes I do that, I'll shove the whole thing through there, but it's really just as quick for me to use the hand plane. And that's all sorted now. So that's this truss rod route now complete, and we can get on with the rest of the neck. That's it for this one. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed the video and it's been useful. If it has, please don't forget to leave me a like, and don't forget to subscribe if you'd like to see more content like this. If you've got any questions on the process in this video, leave me a comment and I'll be glad to get back to you. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.